a story that just called The Riddle. Probably one of the lesser known of the Grimm brothers folk tales. There was once a prince who had a terrible wanderlust. Life at the palace bored him, and he wished to go out into the world and explore the world and have adventures. So he set off one day, but being a prince, he took his trusted servant with him. So the two men left the palace, both on horseback. And after some time, they saw a fair maiden standing outside a run-down cottage. And as of course is the right for travellers, they asked for hospitality. And the maid said, "Indeed, you are welcome in this house, but I must warn you, don't eat anything that my stepmother offers to you, for she practices the dark arts and may have ill intent towards you both." But the prince and his servant were so tired after a long day's riding, that although they heeded the fair maid's warnings, they simply went into the cottage and slept the night there. But being aware of her advice, they neither ate nor drank anything that the old woman offered them. In the morning, the prince was up early and set off on his fine horse. But his servant was still saddling his own horse when the prince had left. So the stepmother came out of the cottage with a cup full of what she said was the tasty drink for the young master. And the servant, remembering what the maiden had said the night before, took the cup. The old woman said, "This is to give to your master. It will give him health and virility." But the servant spilled some of the liquid onto his own horse, and such was the potency of the poison within that the poor horse simply died there and then. And the servant ran after his prince to tell him that he now had no horse. But the prince went back to the horse because he didn't want to abandon the fine saddle. And by the time the servant got back to the horse, a raven, which had been feasting on the horse's flesh, also lay dead beside it. And the servant, who had known hunger, thought, "At least it is meat. Who am I to turn down the meat of a raven?" So he placed the dead raven in his bag and trudged after the prince. That night the two of them had better luck in finding lodgings, for they found an inn where there was much hustle and bustle, many customers, much coming and going. The innkeeper's daughter, who was rather taken with the two handsome young men, said, "Be careful. This is a meeting place of murderers and thieves. Just be careful of the 12 men and the strange woman who was with them." So when the servant handed the serving girl the dead raven, she took it and placed it in the stew that she was making for the 12 murderers, and served it to them. And the raven that had eaten of the dead horse was, of course, by now filled with poison. So all 12 of the murderers died of the poison that had killed the horse. The next morning the fair maid showed the prince and his servant the gold that the robbers had accumulated through their ill deeds. But the prince simply said, "I have no need of such tainted wealth." And the prince and his servant carried on with their journey. And after some time, they came to a city where a king had a princess who, on the one hand, was as beautiful as the morning star, on the other hand, was very haughty and had a heart cold as ice. The princess had no wish to marry, and so she had set a task for her suitors. Anyone who would marry the princess must be able to set a riddle that she could not solve. 9 suitors had tried, 9 suitors had failed, 9 suitors had died, 9 severed heads decorated the gate leading to the palace. Nevertheless, the prince, who was clever and witty and had little to lose, thought he could set a riddle that the princess would not be able to solve. And the riddle he set was this: 1 slew no one, and yet killed 12. Now the princess had 3 days in which to solve the riddle, but she was clever and witty and could solve most riddles in much less than 3 days. But this one presented her with some difficulties. She went through her riddle books, and yet there seemed to be nothing there that was of any help to her. So, getting a little annoyed by now, she sent her own servant girl into the prince's bedchamber to spy on him and see if perhaps, if he spoke in his sleep, he might give her some answers as to what the riddle meant. 1 killed no one, and yet killed 12. But the prince was clever, and it was actually his servant who was sleeping in his room. And so the servant, realizing that the princess's serving girl was there, pulled her cloak from her and kept the cloak as proof that she had been there, and sent her off with a good beating. The next night, the servant slept in the prince's bed, and the princess sent her chambermaid, and again the prince's servant pulled her cloak from her and sent her off. The third night, the prince slept in his own bed, and the princess, realizing that if you want something done, it's best to do it yourself, slipped into his room late at night with her own grey, misty cloak wrapped around her. And the prince tossed and turned in his fake sleep and said, "A raven died and then poisoned 12 men." But as the princess was leaving the room with the answer to the riddle, The young prince pulled her cloak from her and kept it as evidence that she had been there. So the next morning, the judges assembled, and the princess said, "I have the answer. One killed no one and yet killed 12. A raven died of poison and then poisoned 12 murderers." And the judges said, "Indeed, that seems like a plausible answer," although they were very sad that the young and handsome prince would forfeit his head. But the prince said, "The princess gains the answers to the riddles by trickery. Here is the cloak of her serving girl, here is the cloak of her chambermaid, and here the beautiful grey mist cloak is her own. For she hid herself in my bedchamber last night." And of course the princess could not deny this, for truth will always out. And so the judges said, "The cloak, your lovely grey mist cloak, must be embroidered with silver thread. For that, your highness, you will wear on your wedding day." So the prince outwitted the princess, gained a bride, and in the fullness of time gained a kingdom. As to what happened to the servant, the story doesn't tell. It's a very odd story, that one. Perhaps it's not very pleasing. And yet, Shakespeare uses a similar theme in Pericles, Prince of Tyre, thinking about somebody solving a riddle and a very distant princess. Stories about riddles, of course. Well, Tolkien uses that in The Hobbit, and of course the idea of riddles and solving them. Of course, that's a theme that runs through an awful lot of stories. So have fun with riddles, have fun with stories. If you're not already subscribed to my channel, please feel free to. And if you like talking about the Brothers Grimm stories, there is a Facebook group just called Brothers Grimm, a place to just talk about the strange and occasionally unpleasant, but I think generally quite fun world of the Brothers Grimm stories. Enjoy.